July 24, 1945. Cecilienhof Palace, Potsdam. Harry Truman watched Joseph Stalin's face as he delivered what he believed was the most significant secret of the war. The American president had rehearsed this moment, planned his words carefully, decided to keep it casual, almost offhand. He approached the Soviet leader after the plenary session ended, no interpreters close enough to hear clearly, and mentioned that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin's expression barely changed. He nodded, said he was glad to hear it, hoped the Americans would make good use of it against the Japanese. Then he turned away to speak with his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, as if Truman had mentioned nothing more interesting than a new rifle design. Truman walked back to his advisors, satisfied. Secretary of State James Burns smiled. They believed they'd just witnessed a man learning about the atomic bomb for the first time, seeing a dictator process the news that America alone possessed the power to level cities with single weapons. Winston Churchill, watching from across the room, later wrote that Stalin seemed not to grasp the significance of what he'd been told. They were wrong. Stalin had known about the American atomic bomb program for more than 2 years. He knew about the Trinity test in the New Mexico desert 8 days earlier, knew the yield had reached 22 kilotons, knew details about the bomb's design that some American generals didn't know. When he turned to Molotov after Truman walked away, Stalin didn't ask what this new weapon might be. He said, "They're trying to throw dust in our eyes. Tell Kurchatov to speed up the work." But this story begins before Potsdam, before Truman even knew the atomic bomb existed in the final months of Franklin Roosevelt's life. April 1943. A British physicist named Klaus Fuchs arrived at Columbia University in New York, part of the ARPA British delegation to the Manhattan Project. Fuchs was 31, thin, intense, spoke English with a slight German accent. He'd fled Nazi Germany in 1933, earned his doctorate in physics at the University of Edinburgh, been interned briefly as an enemy alien when the war started, then released and recruited for atomic research. British intelligence had vetted him. They'd found nothing concerning. They hadn't looked carefully enough. Fuchs had joined the German Communist Party in 1932 before fleeing to Britain. He'd never stopped believing in communist ideology, never stopped seeing the Soviet Union as the true opponent of fascism. When he understood what the Manhattan Project was building, he made a decision. The Soviet Union deserved to know. The Americans and British couldn't be allowed to monopolize such power. In August 1944, Fuchs met his Soviet contact for the first time on a street corner in New York. He carried a tennis ball. His contact, a man named Harry Gold, carried a book and a pair of gloves. They walked together, Fuchs describing the gaseous diffusion process for enriching uranium, the design principles of the plutonium bomb, the calculations for critical mass. Gold took no notes. He memorized everything, passed it to his NKVD handlers, who encrypted it and sent it to Moscow. By February 1945, Fuchs had transferred to Los Alamos, the secret laboratory in the New Mexico desert where the actual bombs were being assembled. Now he had access to everything: blueprints, test results, theoretical calculations, the precise dimensions of the plutonium core, the design of the explosive lenses that would compress it to criticality. He met Gold again in June, this time in Santa Fe, and handed over a detailed report on the implosion design. Gold drove back to New York. The information reached Moscow within days. Fuchs wasn't the only source. David Greenglass, a machinist at Los Alamos, passed sketches of bomb components to his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. Theodore Hall, a physicist who joined the project at age 18, the youngest scientist at Los Alamos, independently approached Soviet intelligence and offered information. The NKVD called the atomic program enormous, recognition of its scale and significance. They assigned dozens of officers to collect and analyze intelligence from America and Britain. In Moscow, Igor Kurchatov led the Soviet atomic program from a facility called Laboratory Number 2. Kurchatov was 40 years old in 1945, a bearded physicist who'd been studying nuclear fission since the 1930s. Stalin had ordered him to build a Soviet bomb in 1943, after Soviet intelligence first reported the scale of the American effort. Kurchatov had fewer resources, less uranium, no industrial base comparable to America's massive enrichment facilities. But he had something valuable. He had blueprints. When intelligence reports from Fuchs arrived on Kurchatov's desk, he could compare them against his own team's theoretical work. The American designs confirmed some Soviet calculations, corrected others, revealed solutions to problems Kurchatov's team hadn't solved yet. Lavrenti Beria, the head of the NKVD who oversaw both intelligence collection and the bomb program, understood the value immediately. He ordered more resources diverted to Kurchatov, more pressure on the scientists, more intelligence officers assigned to penetrate Manhattan Project security. Roosevelt knew none of this. The president had authorized the Manhattan Project in October 1941, after Albert Einstein and other physicists warned that Nazi Germany might be developing atomic weapons. He'd met with Churchill at Hyde Park in September 1944 and signed an aid memoir agreeing that atomic information would remain secret, shared only between America and Britain, never given to other nations, without mutual consent. Roosevelt and Churchill discussed whether to tell Stalin about the bomb project. They decided against it. The Soviet Union was an ally against Hitler, but Roosevelt didn't trust Stalin with atomic secrets. Stalin already had them. April 12, 1945. Roosevelt died at Warm Springs, Georgia. Harry Truman, vice president for just 82 days, took the oath of office. Truman knew nothing about the atomic bomb. Roosevelt had never briefed him on the Manhattan Project. The new president learned about it 13 days later, on April the 25th, when Secretary of War Henry Stimson came to the White House with Leslie Groves, the general who ran the Manhattan Project's military side. Stimson handed Truman a memorandum. "Within 4 months," it said, "we shall in all probability have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one bomb of which could destroy a whole city." Truman read it twice, asked questions about the science, the timeline, the cost. $2 billion, Groves told him. More than 130,000 people employed at facilities across the country. A city built in the Tennessee wilderness just to enrich uranium. Another in Washington state to produce plutonium. All of it secret, all of it racing toward a single goal. Truman asked if the weapon would work. Groves said they'd know soon. A test was scheduled for July in New Mexico. If it succeeded, they'd have bombs ready for use against Japan by August. July 16th, 1945. 5:29 in the morning. The Trinity test site, Alamogordo, New Mexico. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of Los Alamos, watched from a control bunker as the countdown reached 0. The explosion lit the desert like a second sun, a fireball that rose and churned and formed itself into a mushroom cloud 7 miles high. The shock wave arrived seconds later, a physical blow of pressure and heat. Oppenheimer thought of a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The yield exceeded predictions. 22 kilotons of TNT equivalent, a single bomb that released more explosive energy than 22,000 tons of conventional explosives. The tower that held the bomb vaporized. Sand beneath the explosion melted into glass. Observers 10 miles away felt the heat on their faces. Groves sent an encrypted message to Stimson, who was already in Germany preparing for the Potsdam Conference. Operated on this morning, diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. Stimson understood. He told Truman the same day. The atomic bomb worked. Klaus Fuchs heard about Trinity from colleagues at Los Alamos. He wrote a detailed report, including the yield, the design confirmation, the success of the implosion mechanism. He passed it to Gold at their next meeting. Soviet intelligence transmitted it to Moscow. Beria gave it to Stalin. The Soviet leader read it on July 21st, 3 days before the Potsdam Conference session, where Truman would try to tell him about the bomb. And Stalin already knew. He knew the test had succeeded, knew the Americans would have operational weapons within weeks, knew they planned to use them against Japan. What he didn't know was whether Truman would tell him, and if so, how. Would the Americans share information, propose international control, try to use the weapon as diplomatic leverage? Or would they keep it secret, hoping to maintain a monopoly? July 24th. Truman decided to tell Stalin, but to keep it vague. No details about yields or designs. No mention of the word atomic, just enough to avoid the appearance of hiding something while revealing nothing useful. He consulted with Burns and Stimson. They agreed. Casual approach, brief mention, watch Stalin's reaction. After the day's plenary session ended, Truman walked around the conference table to where Stalin stood, talking with an aide. Churchill watched from across the room, curious. Truman's interpreter, Charles Bolin, stayed back, too far to hear clearly. Truman spoke to Stalin directly, using simple English, assuming Stalin's interpreter would translate. "We have developed a new weapon," Truman said, "of unusual destructive force." Stalin's interpreter, Vladimir Pavlov, translated into Russian. Stalin nodded. His face showed nothing, no surprise, no curiosity, no concern. He replied in Russian, a brief sentence. Pavlov translated back, "That's good. I hope you make good use of it against the Japanese." Truman waited for more. Stalin said nothing else. The Soviet leader turned to speak with Molotov, and Truman walked back to his delegation. Burns met him halfway. He didn't ask a single question, Truman said. Churchill joined them, asking what Stalin had said. Truman told him. Churchill later wrote that Stalin seemed not to understand the significance, that he'd reacted as if Truman had mentioned a new artillery piece. They misread him completely. Stalin understood perfectly. He'd been expecting this conversation, had prepared for it, knew exactly how to respond. Show no interest. Ask no questions. Give Truman no reason to elaborate. Make the Americans think their secret remained secret. Stalin left the conference hall and went immediately to his residence. Molotov joined him there. "They're trying to raise their price," Stalin said, meaning the Americans hoped to use their atomic monopoly as leverage in negotiations over Poland, Germany, Eastern Europe. "Let them. We'll have to talk it over with Kurchatov and get him to speed things up." That night, Stalin sent a coded message to Beria in Moscow. The Americans had tested an atomic weapon and would use it against Japan soon. The Soviet program needed to accelerate. More resources, more uranium, more pressure on the scientists. Beria received the message on July 25th. He called Kurchatov to his office that same day. Kurchatov knew the pressure was coming. His team had been studying the intelligence from Fuchs, using it to refine their own designs, but they still lacked enough enriched uranium for a bomb. The enrichment facilities were behind schedule. The reactors producing plutonium weren't yet operational. Kurchatov estimated they needed at least 3 more years, possibly 4. Beria told him he had less time than that. The Americans would have a monopoly soon, would use it to dictate terms. The Soviet Union needed its own bomb, needed it before the Americans could consolidate their advantage. Whatever resources Kurchatov needed, Beria would provide. Whoever wasn't working hard enough, Beria would replace. The Soviet bomb program became the highest priority in the country after the war itself. August 6, 1945. 9 days after Truman told Stalin about the new weapon. The B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city had a population of approximately 350,000. The bomb detonated at 8:15 in the morning, 2,000 feet above the city center. The fireball incinerated everything within a mile. The shock wave flattened buildings 2 miles from ground zero. Fire spread across the city, merged into a firestorm. By the end of the day, approximately 70,000 people were dead. Tens of thousands more would die from radiation and burns in the following weeks. Truman announced the bombing in a statement released from the White House. 16 hours ago, it began, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. Now the secret was public. The world knew. Stalin's reaction, recorded by multiple sources, was controlled but intense. He called Beria again. The Americans had used the weapon. They demonstrated their power. The Soviet program couldn't wait 3 or 4 years. Beria promised to deliver faster. He ordered the NKVD to find more uranium deposits, to expand the labor camps that mined them, to recruit more scientists whether they wanted to join or not. August 9th. A second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki, approximately 75,000 dead. Japan surrendered 6 days later. The war ended with America as the only nation possessing atomic weapons, the only nation that had used them, the only nation that knew for certain they worked. Except the Soviet Union also knew they worked. Fuchs had provided the design. The Trinity test had proven the concept. Hiroshima and Nagasaki confirmed the destructive power. Kurchatov's team didn't need to start from scratch. They had a blueprint. They just needed to build it. The Soviet program accelerated through late 1945 and into 1946. Beria established a new ministry, the first main directorate, solely to build the bomb. He appointed scientists to leadership positions but made clear the NKVD was watching. Kurchatov worked 18-hour days, coordinating teams across multiple facilities, solving problems with uranium enrichment, reactor design, explosive lens fabrication. The intelligence from Fuchs remained invaluable. When Soviet engineers hit obstacles, they could check the American solutions. When calculations seemed wrong, they could verify against Los Alamos data. Fuchs continued passing information even after the war ended. He returned to Britain in June 1946, took a position at the Harwell Atomic Research Facility, and maintained contact with Soviet intelligence. He provided updates on British atomic work, details on American bomb designs, estimates of how many weapons the Americans had produced. The information flowed to Moscow, to Beria, to Kurchatov. American intelligence suspected there might be leaks from the Manhattan Project, but they focused on the wrong people. The FBI investigated some scientists for communist sympathies, monitored some contacts with Soviet officials, but they didn't identify Fuchs. British intelligence still considered him reliable. He had security clearance. He attended classified briefings. He knew secrets that could accelerate the Soviet program by years. August 29, 1949. 4 years and 13 days after Hiroshima. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The bomb, called RDS-1 or First Lightning, was nearly identical to the American plutonium bomb dropped on Nagasaki. It used the same implosion design, the same explosive lens configuration, the same plutonium core dimensions. The yield was approximately 22 kilotons, matching the Trinity test. Kurchatov watched from a bunker 6 miles away. The explosion lit the steppe, formed the same mushroom cloud Oppenheimer had seen in New Mexico. Soviet scientists cheered. Beria sent an encrypted message to Stalin in Moscow. The test was successful. American intelligence detected the test within days. Air Force planes flying along the Soviet border collected air samples. found radioactive particles consistent with a plutonium bomb. President Truman received the news on September 19th. He'd been told by his advisors that the Soviets wouldn't have a bomb until the mid-1950s at the earliest. Now they had one, years ahead of predictions. The FBI intensified its investigation into atomic espionage. They focused on the Rosenberg network, arrested David Greenglass in June 1950. Greenglass confessed and implicated his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. Julius and his wife Ethel were arrested that summer. The FBI also received information from British intelligence about a possible spy at Harwell. Klaus Fuchs was arrested in February 1950. He confessed almost immediately, providing details about his espionage from 1944 through 1949. He described his contacts with Harry Gold, the information he'd passed, his motivations. He said he'd believed the Soviet Union deserved to know about the atomic bomb, that no single nation should monopolize such power. British courts sentenced him to 14 years in prison, the maximum allowed for espionage. He served 9 years, was released in 1959, and moved to East Germany, where he continued working as a physicist until his death in 1988. The impact of Fuchs's espionage remained classified for decades. American and British officials publicly minimized it, suggested the Soviets would have developed the bomb on their own only slightly later. But Soviet sources after the Cold War ended told a different story. Kurchatov's colleagues said the intelligence from Fuchs had been critical, that it saved years of work, prevented dead ends, confirmed theoretical calculations. The first Soviet bomb was essentially a copy of the American design because Fuchs had provided the complete blueprint. Stalin never publicly acknowledged the espionage. He never admitted he'd known about the atomic bomb when Truman told him at Potsdam. The official Soviet narrative said their scientists had developed the bomb independently, through superior Soviet science. But people close to Stalin knew the truth. Molotov later wrote in his memoirs that Stalin had known about the American bomb program since 1943, had known about Trinity before Truman mentioned the new weapon, had played ignorant at Potsdam to avoid giving anything away. The conversation at Potsdam, that brief exchange on July 24, 1945, was theater. Truman thought he was revealing a secret. Stalin knew he was being tested, knew the Americans wanted to see his reaction, knew the smart play was to show nothing. So he nodded, said he hoped they'd use it well, and turned away. No questions, no surprise, no indication he understood the significance. Behind that blank expression, Stalin was calculating. How many bombs could the Americans build? How quickly? Would they use the monopoly to make demands? Could the Soviet Union catch up before the Americans consolidated their advantage? The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it shaped Stalin's thinking for years. The Soviet bomb program became an obsession, a race against American power, a drive to break the monopoly before it became permanent. By 1953, when Stalin died, the Soviet Union had tested multiple atomic weapons and was developing a hydrogen bomb. The arms race he'd initiated at Potsdam, the acceleration he'd ordered after Truman's casual mention of a new weapon, had become the defining feature of the Cold War. Two superpowers, both with atomic weapons, both building more, both preparing for a war that could destroy civilization. The irony is that Truman's attempt at secrecy accomplished nothing. Stalin already knew. The intelligence network Beria had built, the spies, Fuchs, and others who passed information, had given the Soviet Union access to America's most closely guarded secret. Truman thought he was playing a strong hand at Potsdam, using the bomb as leverage. Stalin was playing a different game entirely, one where he knew Truman's cards and was already planning his response. What did Stalin say when Roosevelt told him about the atomic bomb? Roosevelt never told him. Roosevelt died before the bomb was ready, before Trinity, before anyone knew for certain the weapon would work. It was Truman who told Stalin on a summer evening in Potsdam, trying to be casual, watching for a reaction. Stalin gave him nothing. A nod, a brief comment, a turn away. No indication that he knew, that he'd known for years, that Soviet scientists were already working from stolen blueprints to build their own version. Stalin's response wasn't surprise or concern or curiosity. It was performance, a calculated display of disinterest designed to hide the truth. The truth was that Stalin had known about the atomic bomb since 1943, had been receiving detailed intelligence since 1944, had read about the Trinity test before Truman mentioned it. When Truman said unusual destructive force, Stalin was thinking about Kurchatov's progress, about uranium enrichment rates, about how quickly the Soviet Union could break the American monopoly. He didn't need Truman to tell him about the bomb. He needed Truman to think the secret was still secret. So Stalin said what he'd planned to say, what would give nothing away, what would let the Americans believe their advantage was secure. He said he was glad to hear it. He said he hoped they'd use it against Japan. He said exactly enough to end the conversation without revealing what he knew. And then he went back to his residence and ordered Beria to speed up the work. The race was on. America had the bomb, but the Soviet Union had the blueprints. The question wasn't whether the Soviets would build their own atomic weapons. The question was, how quickly, and whether they could do it before the Americans realized their secrets had been stolen. 4 years later, the mushroom cloud rose over Kazakhstan. Stalin had his answer. The monopoly was broken. The Cold War had its defining characteristic. 2 superpowers, both armed with weapons that could end the world, both preparing for a conflict neither could win. It started with a brief conversation at Potsdam, with Truman's careful words and Stalin's blank expression. It started with what Stalin said when told about the atomic bomb, which was almost nothing, which was exactly what he'd planned to say. The silence was the point. The lack of reaction was the strategy. Stalin knew the secret wasn't revealing what you know. The secret was making sure no one knows what you know. Truman walked away from that conversation believing he'd kept the upper hand. Stalin walked away knowing he'd bought time, kept his advantage hidden, preserved the intelligence network that was already giving the Soviet Union everything it needed. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was an American weapon. The bomb that broke the American monopoly 4 years later was built from American secrets, stolen by Soviet spies, delivered to Soviet scientists who used them to catch up years faster than anyone predicted. Stalin's response at Potsdam was perfect because it revealed nothing. He said what a man who didn't know would say. He acted as if the information meant little. He gave Truman no reason to elaborate, no opening to share details, no indication that the secret had already been compromised. And then he went to work making sure the American advantage wouldn't last, that the monopoly Truman thought he had was already slipping away, that the Soviet Union would have its own atomic weapons before the decade ended. That's what Stalin said when told about the atomic bomb. As little as possible. Just enough to end the conversation. Nothing that would reveal the truth. It was one of the most successful deceptions of the Second World War, a performance so convincing that American leaders didn't realize they'd been played until the mushroom cloud rose over Kazakhstan 4 years later.